portrait had always been described as gentle. Painted in 1856, it showed a small boy seated on a low wooden stool, barefoot, his posture careful and composed. His shirt was clean, his hair neatly kept. Light entered the room from a side window, brushing his cheek with the faintest suggestion of warmth. For over a century, viewers remarked on the stillness of it. The rare tenderness, they said, of a moment spared from cruelty. The boy's eyes did not plead. They did not accuse. They simply watched. He was enslaved, the catalogue noted plainly, as if the word explained everything and nothing at once. What unsettled historians was not what the portrait showed, but how desperately it seemed to want to appear harmless. The brushwork softened the walls. The background dissolved into shadows that asked no questions. Even the boy's hands were centered, folded politely in his lap, cradling something small and dark. Early scholars called it a charm, a trinket, a kindness permitted by an unusually benevolent household. No one looked too closely for a very long time. It was only when modern imaging clarified the object, when the paint's age could no longer blur its edges, that the silence around the portrait broke. The child was not holding the object loosely. His fingers were tense, deliberate, as if he understood the cost of letting go. The thing itself was not decorative. It bore markings too precise, too intentional, to be dismissed as ornament. The boy's expression, once thought serene, shifted under scrutiny. His calm was not peace. It was restraint, and suddenly the portrait no longer felt like a moment preserved, but a moment contained, sealed tight, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally see what he had been forced to hold. The portrait did not announce itself as important when it resurfaced. It emerged quietly from the depths of a European archive during a routine digitization project, cataloged among thousands of colonial-era works that had long since lost their urgency. The painting was wrapped in aging linen, its frame dulled by time, its surface darkened by varnish that had yellowed into a permanent dusk. For decades, it had been stored without ceremony, labeled simply as an anonymous mid-19th century study of a child. Its origins noted in a hand no longer traceable to any living curator. There was nothing about it that demanded attention at first glance, and that was precisely why it had been forgotten. Archivists initially regarded the portrait as another example of domestic realism, the sort favored by traveling artists who documented life in colonial territories for European patrons hungry for images of the distant and the controlled. The boy's composed posture and clean clothing seemed to reinforce this interpretation. He appeared well cared for, almost deliberately presented as proof of order and civility. In an era when art was often used to soften the brutality of empire, the image fit neatly into a familiar narrative. It reassured. It explained away discomfort. It suggested that whatever suffering existed beyond the frame was manageable, even humane. What made the rediscovery notable was not the painting itself, but the absence of any meaningful historical trail attached to it. No plantation records referenced a commissioned portrait. No letters mentioned its shipment or sale. The artist's name, though faintly signed, led nowhere. No exhibitions, no known body of work, no documented career. This lack of context troubled historians, accustomed to the meticulous bookkeeping of colonial economies, where even human lives were accounted for in ink and ledgers. The painting existed in isolation, untethered from the systems that should have produced it. As the archive's curators prepared the portrait for public access, they began to question why it had been preserved at all. Many similar works had been lost, destroyed, or intentionally discarded as tastes and moral sensibilities shifted. Yet this one had survived intact, carried across continents, protected through wars and regime changes, as if someone had deemed it necessary to keep. The decision to preserve it could not be traced, but its consequences lingered. By re-entering the historical record, the portrait invited scrutiny it had somehow avoided for over a century. What had once been dismissed as benign now felt carefully constructed, its calmness too deliberate, its survival too intentional, raising the unsettling possibility that the painting was never meant to explain the past, but to wait patiently for a future willing to look closer. As historians began examining the portrait more closely, attention shifted from its provenance to the child himself, particularly the expression that had once reassured earlier viewers. The boy's face was composed in a way that seemed almost unnatural for his age, his features arranged into a calm that felt practiced rather than instinctive. In the context of 1856, this serenity became troubling. The period was saturated with first-hand accounts of violence, deprivation, and psychological terror inflicted upon enslaved children, whose lives were marked by instability and fear from the moment they could walk. Against this documented reality, the boy's stillness stood out not as evidence of kindness, but as an anomaly demanding explanation. Historians compared the portrait to testimonies, plantation logs, and abolitionist records from the same decade. These sources painted a grim and consistent picture. Children were separated from parents, punished publicly, and conditioned early to suppress emotion as a means of survival. In this light, the child's expression took on a different meaning. His eyes did not reflect innocence or ease, but a learned neutrality, the kind cultivated in environments where drawing attention to oneself could invite harm. The absence of visible distress was not comforting. It suggested something had already been taken from him. Further analysis revealed subtle details that reinforced this interpretation. The boy's gaze was fixed, not wandering or curious as one might expect, but anchored just beyond the viewer, as if trained to focus on a point that did not move. His mouth was relaxed, yet unnaturally still, lacking the tension or softness typical of a child at rest. Even his posture, upright but not rigid, mirrored the bearing described in accounts of enslaved children instructed to remain composed under watchful eyes. These were not the gestures of peace, but of discipline deeply internalized. The contrast between the portrait's quietness and the era's brutality sharpened the discomfort surrounding it. Artists of the time often sanitized reality to appeal to patrons, but historians began to suspect this image was not merely idealized, it was performative. The child appeared to be enacting an expectation, presenting a version of himself designed to satisfy those in power. His calm was not offered freely, but required, shaped by forces invisible within the frame, but unmistakable in the historical record. As this realization took hold, the portrait ceased to function as a simple visual artifact. It became a document of psychological adaptation under extreme oppression, capturing not a moment of respite, but the aftermath of conditioning. The boy's expression no longer softened the image, it intensified it. What once seemed gentle now read as evidence of endurance, of a child forced to master stillness in a world that punished vulnerability, leaving historians to confront the unsettling possibility that the most disturbing violence of the period was not what was depicted openly, but what had already succeeded in erasing itself from his face. The object in the boy's hands had always been the most overlooked detail of the portrait, dismissed for generations with a casualness that now seemed willful. Early descriptions referred to it vaguely, often contradicting one another, calling it a charm, a small book, a carved toy, or a religious token. Its dark surface blended easily into the shadows of the boy's lap, and the softening effects of aged varnish allowed the eye to slide past it without pause. For a long time, viewers saw what they expected to see, a harmless accessory meant to humanize the subject and reassure the audience that the scene was benign. It took modern magnification to disrupt that comfort. When conservators conducted a high-resolution scan as part of the digitization process, the object emerged with startling clarity. Its shape was neither playful nor devotional. It was narrow, angular, and deliberately crafted, with edges worn smooth by repeated handling. Fine markings ran along one side, not decorative, but precise, arranged with an intention that resisted ornamental interpretation. The surface bore shallow grooves that caught the light unevenly, suggesting use rather than display. Whatever it was, it had not been placed in the boy's hands for aesthetic balance alone. As the image sharpened, historians noticed something more unsettling than the object itself, the way the child held it. His fingers were not relaxed. They curved inward with purpose, pressing against the object as if anchoring it. The tension was subtle but unmistakable, visible in the slight whitening of the knuckles and the careful positioning of his thumbs. This was not the grip of a child idly holding a toy, nor the casual clasp of a posed subject. It was controlled, deliberate, as though the object required attention, vigilance, perhaps even protection. Researchers began comparing the markings on the object with known artifacts from the mid-19th century, particularly those associated with enslaved communities. What they found challenged long-standing assumptions. The grooves resembled tali marks, but not in any standardized system used by plantation overseers or merchants. They were irregular, unevenly spaced, sometimes intersecting, sometimes abruptly stopping. Similar markings had been documented on forbidden objects crafted in secret by enslaved individuals, items used to preserve memory, count losses, or encode personal histories that could not be written down openly. These objects were rarely preserved, often destroyed when discovered, their existence recorded only through scattered testimonies. The possibility that the boy was holding such an item raised immediate questions. Enslaved children were typically denied personal possessions, especially those that could not be easily explained or controlled. Anything resembling a tool, record, or symbol of autonomy would have been confiscated. For the object to appear in a formal portrait suggested either an extraordinary oversight or something more troubling, that its significance was invisible to those who believed themselves fully in control. The artist may not have understood what he was painting, or perhaps he chose not to. As scholars examined the painter's technique, they noticed that the object had been rendered with unusual care compared to other details. The fabric of the boy's clothing was suggested with broad strokes, the background left intentionally vague, but the object was sharply defined, its contours carefully preserved, even as surrounding elements softened into shadow. This imbalance hinted at intention, as though the artist, consciously or not, had been drawn to the thing in the child's hands, recognizing it as the true center of the composition. Further scrutiny revealed faint discoloration along the object's surface, darker patches that did not align with the rest of the painting's aging. Chemical analysis suggested these areas had absorbed organic material before the paint fully cured, likely from repeated contact with skin. This indicated the object had been handled extensively prior to the sitting, perhaps carried constantly, hidden against the body, brought out only when necessary. The idea that the boy had insisted on holding it during the portrait session began to feel less speculative and more inevitable. Theories multiplied, each more unsettling than the last. Some historians proposed the object functioned as a mnemonic device, a tactile record of family members sold away, each mark corresponding to a name no longer spoken aloud. Others suggested it was a protective talisman, not spiritual in the way Europeans understood faith, but practical, rooted in survival and remembrance. There were even whispers that the markings represented time, a private calendar counting days since an irreversible loss, or days until something feared or anticipated. None of these interpretations could be confirmed, yet all shared a common implication. The object existed to hold something the boy could not afford to forget. What disturbed scholars most was the realization that the portrait's calm depended on this object's presence. Without it, the child's composure felt inexplicable. With it, his restraint made sense. The object was not incidental. It was stabilizing him, grounding him in something beyond the room, beyond the gaze of the viewer. It suggested an inner life carefully concealed, a narrative running parallel to the one the portrait appeared to tell. As the magnified image circulated among experts, consensus emerged around one unsettling conclusion. The object was not meant to be seen, not truly. Its power lay in being overlooked, mistaken for something harmless. The boy's hands, positioned so carefully, were not displaying it, but containing it, ensuring it survived the moment without revealing itself. In that realization, the portrait shifted irrevocably, transforming from a record of supposed gentleness into evidence of resistance so quiet it had hidden in plain sight for over a century, waiting for technology, patience, and a willingness to doubt the surface of things, to finally bring it into focus as attention deepened around the portrait. Historians began searching for the place it had come from, expecting the usual paper trail that followed 19th century plantations with relentless precision. Instead, they encountered absence. The estate, named faintly in the painting's original catalog entry, appeared briefly in shipping records, then vanished. Tax documents referenced it once, census data listed it without detail, and then the name ceased to exist altogether. Within 5 years of the portrait's estimated completion, the plantation had dissolved from official maps, as if it had never fully occupied the land it claimed. This disappearance was not merely administrative. Plantations rarely vanished without trace. Even when estates were abandoned due to debt, disease, or rebellion, their remnants lingered in court filings, inheritance disputes, or land transfers. The economy of enslavement was obsessive in its documentation, recording transactions down to the smallest fraction of a person's life. For an entire plantation to fade so completely suggested something abnormal, something that resisted being absorbed back into the system that created it. Historians expanded their search outward, examining regional records, shipping manifests, and correspondence from neighboring estates. Mentions of the plantation surfaced only obliquely, in letters that avoided specifics and in ledgers where its name appeared scratched out or overwritten. One merchant referenced the southern property, rather than naming it. A clergyman's journal described visiting an estate that was no longer receiving guests. Despite being fully operational only months earlier, these fragments hinted at a deliberate retreat from visibility rather than a sudden collapse. The timing unsettled researchers. The years following the portrait's creation coincided with heightened tensions across the region, marked by increased resistance among enslaved populations and growing paranoia among owners. There were recorded incidents of mass punishment, unexplained fires, and sudden sales of entire labor forces. Yet no single event was ever linked directly to the vanished plantation. It did not burn publicly, nor was it seized by creditors. It simply thinned, receded, and then slipped out of the record entirely. What remained were rumors preserved at the edges of documentation. A court clerk noted a case that was never filed. A land surveyor marked a creage as unclaimed. Despite previous ownership, oral histories collected decades later referenced a place where no one stayed long, and where children were moved before dawn. These accounts were treated cautiously, but their consistency was difficult to ignore. Something had occurred that made permanence undesirable, even dangerous. The disappearance took on greater significance when historians compared it to the portrait itself. The painting had survived intact, transported across borders, carefully stored, while the physical site of its creation had been allowed to dissolve. It was as though the image had been preserved at the expense of the place it came from, as if one was meant to endure, while the other was meant to be forgotten. This inversion troubled scholars, accustomed to artifacts outlasting memory, not replacing it. Speculation followed, cautious but persistent. Some proposed the plantation was quietly dismantled after attracting unwanted attention, its enslaved population redistributed to prevent scrutiny. Others suggested disease or internal conflict rendered the land undesirable, prompting owners to erase its name to avoid association. Yet none of these explanations accounted for the thoroughness of its disappearance. Even shame leaves records. Even failure leaves debts. This plantation left almost nothing. What sharpened the unease was the realization that the boy in the portrait would have lived through this erasure. If the painting dated to 1856 and the plantation vanished by 1861, then whatever happened occurred within the span of his childhood. The calm he exhibited in the portrait now seemed less like a momentary stillness and more like a posture shaped by impending instability. His world was already dissolving, even as it was being carefully rendered in oil. Researchers began to consider the possibility that the plantation's disappearance was not accidental but strategic. Erasure can be a form of control, especially when memory itself becomes a liability. If something had occurred that threatened exposure, removing the place from maps and documents would have been easier than explaining it. In such a scenario, the portrait's survival felt less coincidental. It was portable, deniable, capable of being reframed as art rather than evidence. The contrast between the painting's preservation and the plantation's vanishing forced historians to rethink the image's purpose. It no longer read as a simple likeness, but as a fragment salvaged from a larger story that someone had tried to dismantle. The boy's presence endured, while the environment that shaped him was systematically unmade, leaving the portrait floating free of context, its meaning suspended. By the time researchers exhausted the available records, the plantation had become more absence than place, defined by what could not be found rather than what could. That absence pressed against the portrait, filling its quiet background with unspoken implications. The image no longer stood alone, but pointed backward toward a landscape that had been deliberately erased, suggesting that whatever the boy held in his hands was connected not only to personal memory, but to a site that history itself had been instructed to forget. The search for the artist began as a formality, an attempt to anchor the portrait to a recognizable hand, a known body of work, something that could stabilize its growing strangeness. At first, there was little to go on. The signature in the lower corner was faint, abbreviated, rendered in a style common enough to resist attribution. No exhibitions listed the name. No academies recorded it. It was as though the painter had stepped briefly into visibility for this single work, then receded. But persistence yielded fragments, and fragments, once assembled, began to suggest intention rather than accident. The breakthrough came not from art institutions, but from private correspondence uncovered in a regional estate archive unrelated to the vanished plantation. Among receipts and social invitations lay a bundle of letters written in the same hand, dated within a decade of the portrait. The writer was itinerant, moving between properties, accepting commissions that were modest and rarely documented. His tone was observant, occasionally uneasy, more diaristic than professional. He wrote about light, about rooms prepared hastily for sittings, about subjects who did not meet his gaze. And then, in one letter, he mentioned the child. The reference was brief, almost reluctant. He described the sitting as difficult, not because the boy moved or resisted, but because of what he would not release. The artist wrote of asking the child to set aside the little thing, so his hands could be posed more conventionally. He noted that the request was repeated, gently at first, then with pressure from others present. The boy did not respond verbally. He simply tightened his grip. The artist observed this, with a mixture of frustration and fascination, remarking that it was the only moment during the sitting when the child's composure wavered, though even then it did not break. What unsettled historians was not the refusal itself, but the way the artist described it. He did not frame it as defiance. Instead, he wrote that the child seemed to regard the object as necessary, not precious in a sentimental sense, but essential, as though removing it would render the sitting impossible. The artist confessed uncertainty about whether he was witnessing stubbornness or something closer to obligation. He ultimately chose to paint the boy as he was, noting that to insist further would have required force. This admission shifted the tone of the portrait irrevocably. The object in the boy's hands was no longer an incidental detail overlooked by convention. It was present because the child had made it so. In an environment defined by coercion, where even posture and expression were dictated, this small insistence carried disproportionate weight. The artist's letter suggested that the boy's calm was conditional, dependent on maintaining contact with whatever he held. Without it, the stillness that had so impressed viewers might have fractured. Further letters deepened this impression. In another, written weeks later, the artist reflected on the sitting with lingering unease. He wrote that he had painted many children, but never one who seemed to be guarding something. Rather than simply holding it, he questioned whether he had captured the likeness truthfully or merely recorded a surface arranged for survival. There was a suggestion, subtle but unmistakable, that the object frightened others in the room, not because they recognized it, but because they did not. It resisted easy categorization, and unfamiliar things in such settings were often treated as threats. The letters also revealed the artist's awareness of his own position. He acknowledged that he was a guest, dependent on commissions, constrained by expectations. He wrote that he chose silence over inquiry, paint over protest. Yet the fact that he recorded the incident at all suggested it troubled him deeply. He could have omitted it. Instead, he preserved it privately, as if uncertain whether the image alone was sufficient to carry what he had witnessed. Historians debated the implications. Some argued that the artist's compliance was a form of passive complicity, allowing the portrait to present an illusion of tranquility while concealing coercion. Others suggested that by honoring the boy's insistence, however minimally, the artist allowed something genuine to enter the frame. The truth likely lay somewhere between. The letters did not portray the artist as heroic, but neither did they depict him as indifferent. He was an observer caught between recognition and self-preservation. What emerged most clearly was the realization that the portrait was shaped by a quiet negotiation. The boy's presence was not entirely controlled. It was mediated through this object he refused to relinquish. The calm that viewers mistook for peace was, in fact, a condition the child maintained only by holding on to something that anchored him against forces unseen in the painting, but felt in the letters. The artist, knowingly or not, documented this compromise. The existence of the letters complicated any attempt to interpret the portrait as purely aesthetic. They revealed the moment as contested, charged with unspoken tension. The child's hands were not arranged by the artist's design, but by the boy's resolve. That detail, once understood, reframed the entire image. The painting was no longer a simple representation imposed from above. It was the result of a rare boundary drawn by someone with almost no power to draw one at all. By insisting on holding the object, the child shaped how he would be seen, how long he would be remembered, and what questions would eventually be asked. The artist's reluctant accommodation preserved that insistence in oil and pigment, even as the world around the boy worked to erase every other trace of his autonomy, leaving behind a portrait whose quiet unease originated not in what was painted, but in what the child refused to surrender. As scholars traced the object's meaning beyond the frame of the portrait and the artist's letters, their focus shifted to the clandestine systems of knowledge enslaved people used to survive cultural annihilation. These systems were rarely written, almost never sanctioned, and deliberately designed to evade the understanding of those in power. Songs carried maps. Braids marked routes. Knots, carvings, and scars became records when paper was forbidden or dangerous. The object in the boy's hands began to resemble not a personal keepsake, but a fragment of this broader, hidden language. Ethnographers and historians compared the markings on the object to artifacts recovered from burial sites, riverbanks, and hidden quarters, items often dismissed as debris until patterns emerged. Some bore similar incisions, shallow but intentional, created with whatever tools were available. These marks did not correspond to any known European system of counting or notation, yet they appeared repeatedly across regions, separated by distance, but united by bondage. Their purpose was not to be read easily, but to be remembered by touch, by repetition, by those who had been taught their meaning in whispers and gestures. What distinguished these objects was their dual nature. To an untrained eye, they were meaningless, even childish. To those who understood them, they were repositories of identity. They carried names that could not be spoken, lineages broken by sale, stories that risked punishment if shared aloud. In a world where enslaved people were reduced to inventory, these objects asserted continuity, a refusal to let memory be wholly seized. That a child might be entrusted with such an item suggested not innocence, but responsibility. The idea that the boy was holding something forbidden reframed his presence in the portrait. Children were often used as conduits for cultural preservation precisely because they were underestimated. Adults carrying such objects faced immediate suspicion, but a child's possession could pass unnoticed, dismissed as play. This invisibility was strategic. Knowledge survived by hiding where power did not bother to look. The boy's age, his small hands, his apparent calm, all contributed to the object's concealment. Historians noted that these practices were not acts of open resistance, but of endurance. They did not seek to overthrow the system directly, but to outlast it. Memory in this context was a form of defiance. To remember who you were, who you belonged to, and what had been taken was to resist complete domination. The object's markings, irregular and personal, suggested it was not mass-produced or symbolic in a general sense. It was specific, tailored to a single story or family line. The risk associated with such items cannot be overstated. Discovery could result in severe punishment, as any unsanctioned object implied autonomy. That the boy held it openly during the portrait sitting was therefore extraordinary. It implied either that its meaning was successfully obscured, or that its importance outweighed the danger of exposure. In either case, the act of holding it was not passive. It was a calculated decision, one that relied on the assumptions of those watching him. As researchers examined comparable cases, They found accounts of children and instructed never to explain what they carried, only to keep it close. The knowledge was not always explicit. Sometimes the child did not know every meaning embedded in the object, only that it must not be lost. Understanding could unfold later, when circumstances allowed. This layered transmission ensured survival even if one generation was interrupted. The object became a bridge between past and future, carried forward by small hands, because those hands were the least suspected. The portrait thus captured more than a likeness. It froze a moment in an ongoing act of preservation. The boy's stillness masked a role far older than him, one inherited rather than chosen. His calm was the surface of a deeper vigilance, the kind required to safeguard something fragile yet vital. The object was not merely held, it was entrusted. This interpretation unsettled traditional readings of the image because it shifted agency toward the enslaved child. He was no longer simply a subject arranged by others, but a participant in a quiet network of survival. The portrait, intended perhaps to display order and control, inadvertently recorded the persistence of something that control could not fully extinguish. The object's true function lay not in what it showed, but in what it carried forward, unseen and unacknowledged, sustained through silence, touch, and the careful passing of memory from one generation to the next as the object's cultural significance came into sharper focus. A deeper unease emerged from a different realization, one that unsettled even the most cautious scholars. The item the boy held should not have existed in that specific place and time, at least not according to established historical records. The materials suggested origins outside the region where the plantation once stood. The markings echoed practices documented decades later or hundreds of miles away. Yet here it was, captured unmistakably in an 1856 portrait, present before the conditions that supposedly allowed such objects to circulate had formally developed. This contradiction forced historians to confront the limits of their timelines. Much of what is known about covert cultural preservation among enslaved populations comes from fragments gathered after emancipation or from later ethnographic study. These sources, valuable as they are, often imply that such practices evolved gradually, responding to shifting constraints. The portrait challenged that assumption. It suggested not emergence, but continuity. The object was not an innovation of desperation, but evidence of a system already in place, refined enough to be entrusted to a child and subtle enough to remain undetected. Geographic inconsistencies compounded the problem. The incisions on the object bore resemblance to symbols associated with regions far removed from the plantation's documented trade routes. There was no clear explanation for how such knowledge could have traveled intact across distances designed to fracture communities. Enslavement was structured to isolate, to sever connections deliberately. And yet the object implied transmission, not just of people, but of memory, technique, and meaning. Something had moved beneath the notice of record keepers, following paths that did not appear on maps. Attempts to reconcile this anomaly exposed uncomfortable gaps in the historical record. Scholars began to suspect that the absence was not accidental. Official documents reflected what those in power deemed relevant. They tracked labor, property, punishment, and profit, but they did not record the movement of ideas unless those ideas disrupted control openly. What the object represented operated below that threshold. It did not announce itself. It adapted, borrowing forms that appeared innocuous while carrying something else entirely. The implication was sobering. If this object existed when and where it supposedly could not, then much of what historians believed about the visibility of resistance and cultural survival was incomplete. The portrait was not an outlier, but a rare piece of evidence that had escaped erasure. It hinted at a parallel history unfolding alongside the documented one, quieter, less legible, but no less real. The boy's presence suggested that children were not merely passive recipients of this hidden knowledge, but active carriers within it. Further complicating matters was the plantation's disappearance. If the object belonged to a network that extended beyond that place, then the site's erasure may have been linked to forces historians had yet to name. The plantation may not have been exceptional in wealth or output, but it could have been significant in ways that threatened the illusion of total control. The object's existence hinted that the enslaved community there had retained connections, practices, and forms of remembrance that exceeded what was supposed to be possible under such conditions. This contradiction resisted tidy explanation. It refused to align with accepted chronologies or geographic boundaries. Every attempt to situate the object within known frameworks only highlighted how inadequate those frameworks were. The portrait became a fixed point around which certainty unraveled. Rather than clarifying the past, it exposed how much had been overlooked, misunderstood, or deliberately ignored. The boy, once seen as an isolated figure, now appeared as part of something larger, something that extended backward and forward, beyond the frame. His hands held proof that history had been happening where no one thought to look. That knowledge had been moving without permission. That continuity had survived where rupture was assumed. The contradiction was not a flaw to be resolved, but a signal pointing toward a past that had learned to exist in the spaces between records, sustained by people who understood that survival sometimes depended on remaining unseen while carrying forward what should not have been possible to carry at all. The closer scholars examined the boy's hands, the more the original assumptions about their purpose dissolved. At first glance, the grip had been interpreted as protective, even possessive, reinforcing the idea that the object was precious or fragile. But when the image was studied frame by frame, finger by finger, that interpretation began to feel insufficient. The positioning of the hands did not align with how one naturally cradles something meant to be cherished. Instead, the boy's fingers formed a measured enclosure, each joint angled with restraint rather than comfort, suggesting not affection but control. Anatomists and art historians were consulted to analyze the posture more precisely. They noted that the boy's thumbs were placed along the object's edges rather than resting atop it, a position more consistent with preventing movement than securing grip. The palms did not cup inward. They pressed. The wrists were slightly elevated, indicating tension sustained over time rather than a relaxed hold for the duration of a sitting. This was not the posture of a child afraid of dropping something. It was the posture of someone ensuring something stayed exactly as it was. That distinction altered the emotional logic of the portrait. If the boy was restraining the object, rather than simply holding it, then the object itself might not have been passive. It may have been unstable, incomplete, or capable of revealing something if mishandled. The hands, then, were not just carrying meaning but containing it. The boy was acting as a boundary. This idea found unsettling support in comparative imagery from the same period. In other portraits of enslaved subjects, hands were often posed deliberately by artists to convey submission or usefulness. Open palms suggested honesty. Folded hands suggested obedience. Tools were held loosely, emphasizing function rather than agency. The boy's hands matched none of these conventions. They were closed, but not clenched. Still, but not surrendered. The ambiguity resisted the visual language of control that defined so much of the era's art. Scholars began to consider the psychological implications of restraint as a learned behavior. In environments where expression could invite punishment, control became survival. Children learned not only what to hide, but how to hide it physically, using their bodies as barriers. The boy's hands appeared trained for this purpose, accustomed to maintaining a boundary without drawing attention. This was not instinctive secrecy, but practiced containment. The object itself offered further clues. Under magnification, faint abrasions were visible along its edges, inconsistent with simple wear from handling. These marks suggested pressure, applied repeatedly in the same areas, as if the object had been gripped firmly during moments of stress. The boy's hands in the portrait mirrored those points of contact exactly, reinforcing the idea that what was being depicted was not an abstract pose, but a familiar action, one rehearsed long before the artist arrived. This raised a disturbing possibility that the object carried not only memory, but danger. Not in the sense of physical harm, but in what it represented if revealed or misinterpreted. The boy's restraint may have been less about preserving the object and more about limiting its exposure. His hands were positioned to obscure its markings, just enough to render them unreadable, even under direct observation. What little could be seen was fragmented, stripped of context. Art historians noted how the lighting in the portrait seemed to cooperate with this concealment. Shadows fell naturally across the object's surface, breaking up its form. Whether intentional or not, the effect was the same. The hands and light worked together to deny clarity. The boy's restraint extended beyond physical pressure into compositional obscurity. This interpretation reframed the child's role once again. He was no longer simply preserving memory, but actively managing risk. His calmness, previously read as emotional detachment or resignation, now appeared strategic. To restrain something requires focus. It demands stillness not as surrender, but as vigilance. The boy's expression, when viewed through this lens, took on a new intensity. His gaze was steady not because he was unfeeling, but because distraction could loosen his control. The idea that an enslaved child might be entrusted not just with preservation, but with containment unsettled many assumptions about power and awareness. It implied that children were not shielded from danger or complexity, but initiated into it early, taught how to carry weight invisibly. The boy's hands became the clearest evidence of this burden, revealing a discipline imposed not by the artist or the setting, but by the knowledge he carried and the consequences of its exposure. As this understanding took hold, the portrait's stillness became increasingly oppressive. The hands no longer seemed small or delicate. They seemed purposeful, holding back something that could not be allowed to surface. The object was not simply protected from loss. It was restrained from becoming known, and the boy, through posture alone, revealed that he understood exactly what was at stake as scholars wrestled with the nature of the object. And the boy's careful restraint, a more troubling interpretation surfaced, one that reframed everything that had come before. The object did not merely preserve memory or conceal forbidden knowledge, it suggested anticipation. Its markings, once assumed to record what had already been lost, began to resemble something else entirely when examined alongside regional patterns of violence and disappearance. Certain incisions aligned not with past events, but with dates, intervals, and absences that occurred after the portrait was painted, as if the object were oriented toward what was coming rather than what had already happened. This realization unsettled the assumption that enslaved people were always reacting to brutality rather than anticipating it. Plantation life was governed by cycles of punishment, sale, and removal that, while unpredictable to outsiders, often followed internal rhythms known to those trapped within them. Families learned to read signs as sudden inventory, The arrival of unfamiliar overseers, whispered changes in schedules. Violence rarely arrived without warning for those who had learned how to listen. The object in the boy's hands appeared to encode such warnings, not as explicit predictions, but as patterns recognized by those trained to see them. Historians began comparing the object's markings to records of forced removals, executions, and mass sales that occurred in the region in the years following 1856. The correlations were imperfect but persistent. Gaps between marks mirrored gaps between known incidents. Clusters appeared before periods of documented upheaval. This did not suggest clairvoyance, but preparedness. The object may have been a tool for tracking escalation, a way to measure how close violence was drawing, how little time remained before something irrevocable occurred. In this light, the boy's restraint took on a new and darker meaning. If the object carried foreknowledge, even in partial or symbolic form, then holding it was not comforting. It was heavy with inevitability. The boy was not clinging to memory for solace, but gripping awareness he could not unlearn. His calm was no longer just survival. It was the stillness of someone who knows what is approaching and understands that reacting too early or too visibly could hasten it. This interpretation aligned disturbingly well with the plantation's disappearance. If the object encoded warning signs, then the boy may have lived through the very events it anticipated. The portrait, frozen in time, captured him at the edge of something not yet visible to history, but already sensed within the community. What followed may have been precisely what the object was designed to prepare for: dispersal, erasure, the breaking apart of lives in ways that could not be undone. Scholars were cautious not to impose narrative where certainty was impossible, yet the convergence of evidence proved difficult to dismiss. Enslaved communities were often forced to plan for catastrophe as a matter of routine. Children were not spared this knowledge. They absorbed it indirectly through tone, behavior, and the objects placed in their care. The object may have functioned as a silent tutor, teaching the boy how to recognize danger without naming it, how to endure what was coming without betraying awareness. This reframing cast the portrait as something closer to a threshold than a document. The boy was not preserved in a moment of peace, but suspended at the brink of violence yet to unfold. His posture was not passive. It was braced. The object did not ground him in the past, but oriented him toward the future, one shaped by forces already in motion. The stillness was not absence of fear, but mastery over it. The idea that the portrait contained a warning unsettled traditional historical comfort. Artifacts are often treated as remnants of what has already occurred, not signals of what was imminent. Yet for those living within oppressive systems, the future was not abstract. It was rehearsed, anticipated, and carried internally long before it arrived. The object suggested that the boy was part of this rehearsal, entrusted with knowledge that would soon cease to be theoretical. This understanding also reframed the portrait's emotional weight. Viewers had long been disturbed by the sense that something was wrong beneath its calm. Now that unease had a direction. The painting did not ask the viewer to mourn what had already been destroyed, but to reckon with how early violence announces itself and how quietly it is learned. The boy's eyes, steady and unflinching, seemed no longer directed at the present, but fixed somewhere ahead, toward a future he could not escape but had been taught to endure. If the object carried foreknowledge, then its survival mattered not because it preserved the past, but because it testified to an awareness history preferred to deny that the enslaved were not simply victims caught unaware by cruelty, but witnesses to its approach, readers of its patterns, children included. The portrait thus became less a record of innocence lost and more an indictment of a system so predictable in its violence that even a child could be taught to recognize its advance and hold that knowledge silently, waiting for the moment when restraint would no longer be enough. The time historians reached the final stage of their analysis. The portrait had ceased to function as an artifact, meant to be interpreted through conventional categories. It no longer belonged comfortably to art history, social documentation, or even cultural anthropology. Each attempt to situate it within an established framework stripped it of its most unsettling quality, its insistence on being read not as evidence of what had been, but as an intentional transmission aimed forward. The image resisted closure. It did not resolve into understanding so much as it redirected attention, urging viewers to recognize that its purpose may never have been to explain the past at all. This shift began with the recognition that everything about the portrait's survival was improbable. Countless similar images had been lost, destroyed, or quietly discarded as the moral narratives surrounding slavery evolved. Yet this one endured. It crossed borders. It remained intact. It waited. The plantation vanished. The artist dissolved into obscurity. The boy's name disappeared entirely. But the image persisted as if selected for endurance. That persistence no longer felt accidental. It suggested intention operating beyond individual agency, as though the portrait had been positioned deliberately to outlast the circumstances of its creation. When viewed through this lens, the portrait's calm composition took on a different function. Rather than soothing the viewer, it disarmed them. The absence of overt violence allowed it to circulate freely, unchallenged, welcomed into archives and collections that might have rejected a more explicit depiction. Its surface compliance became its camouflage. The image did not confront, it waited. Only when examined slowly, patiently, with a willingness to question what appeared obvious did its deeper implications emerge. This was not documentation designed to persuade contemporaries, but a vessel meant to be reopened by those distant enough to look without immediate consequence. The boy's presence at the center of this vessel became increasingly significant. He was not portrayed as suffering or defiant, roles that history often assigns retrospectively to the enslaved. Instead, he was composed, alert, and restrained. His expression did not ask for rescue. It did not appeal to empathy. It simply endured the gaze. This refusal to perform expected emotion felt deliberate, as though the portrait rejected the comfort of moral clarity. It forced the viewer to sit with ambiguity, to confront the unsettling possibility that survival sometimes required withholding meaning until the conditions for recognition existed. Historians began to describe the portrait not as a representation, but as a message. Messages are shaped by what they must pass through. In this case, the image had to move through systems invested in denial. It had to appear harmless to survive. That requirement shaped every visible choice: the lighting, the posture, the stillness. The object in the boy's hands, once dismissed as incidental, now appeared as the core of this message, its significance deliberately obscured to ensure its preservation. The portrait was not meant to reveal its truth immediately. It was meant to endure long enough to be deciphered. This reframing altered the ethical relationship between viewer and image. To look at the portrait now was not to observe history from a safe distance, but to be implicated in a delayed exchange. The boy's gaze, once thought passive, felt increasingly direct, not accusatory, but expectant. The portrait seemed to ask whether the viewer was finally prepared to see what had been hidden in plain sight. It was no longer enough to acknowledge the brutality of slavery in abstract terms. The image demanded recognition of the sophistication with which enslaved people navigated that brutality, preserving knowledge, anticipating harm, and communicating across time despite systemic erasure. The idea of the portrait as a warning, rather than a record, unsettled many scholars. Warnings imply responsibility. They suggest that the information conveyed was meant to alter perception, to interrupt complacency. If the portrait functioned this way, then its survival placed an obligation on those who encountered it. To see it merely as art was to miss its purpose. To admire its calm without interrogating its construction was to replicate the conditions that had allowed its message to remain unread for so long. This interpretation also reframed the boy's silence. Silence, in this context, was not absence but strategy. He did not speak because speaking was never the point. The portrait communicated through endurance rather than declaration. Its power lay in restraint, in the careful calibration of what could be shown without being destroyed. The boy's hands, his posture, his gaze all participated in this economy of survival. He was not memorialized as a victim frozen in time, but as a participant in a long act of transmission that extended beyond his own life. By the end of the inquiry, the portrait no longer felt complete in itself. It functioned instead as an opening, a threshold into histories that had learned to move invisibly. Its meaning was not fixed but activated by attention. The longer it was studied, the more it resisted containment, refusing to settle into a single interpretation. This refusal felt intentional, as though the image understood that certainty could be another form of erasure. What had once been described as peaceful now felt charged with urgency. The portrait did not depict violence, but it bore its imprint. It did not explain suffering, but it anticipated recognition. In surviving as it did, it accomplished what so few records of enslavement were able to do. It carried forward not just evidence of harm, but evidence of awareness, preparation, and deliberate continuity. The boy, unnamed and undocumented, emerged not as a relic of history, but as its quiet interlocutor, holding something the world was never meant to notice until it was finally ready to understand that the calm it mistook for innocence had always been a message waiting to be received in the end. There was nothing left to uncover in the archives. No final letter. No hidden ledger. No document that named the boy or explained what became of him. History offered only its familiar silence. Yet the portrait no longer needed corroboration. It had already said what it was capable of saying. What endured was the realization that the image had completed its task the moment it was truly seen. The warning it carried did not concern a single plantation, or a single child, or even a single era. It spoke instead to a pattern so old and so practiced that it could disguise itself as calm, as order, as gentleness. The portrait revealed how violence learned to hide behind stillness and how those trapped within it learned to communicate without speaking, to prepare without being noticed, to survive without being acknowledged. The boy's fate remained unknowable, but his awareness did not vanish with him. It persisted in the object he held, in the posture he maintained, in the image that outlived the world that tried to erase him. His restraint was no longer tragic in its silence, it was precise. He had held what needed to be held until holding was no longer his responsibility. For those who finally understood, the portrait could not be returned to its former place of quiet admiration. It unsettled every easy narrative about innocence and ignorance. It refused the comfort of believing that brutality was always sudden or that its victims were unaware of its approach. It insisted, instead, that knowledge had always been present, passed carefully through hands too small to be noticed, carried forward by those history assumed had nothing to carry. The painting still hangs, unchanged in pigment and frame, but it does not rest. It watches, it waits, not for pity and not for outrage, but for recognition. It asks the viewer to consider how many warnings have been mistaken for calm, how many messages have survived only because they learned how to remain unseen. And in that recognition, the story does not close. It transfers.